After divorce at 74, I was left homeless. My husband said, "I always loved your sister more than you." He married my sister and brought her to our house. But a month later, a lawyer called. "Your first husband from the 1970s died and left you $89 million. When my ex found out, good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I was 74 years old when the life I had built over 4 decades crumbled in a single afternoon. My name is Dorothy Ellison, Dot, to those who knew me well. I had lived in the same house in Savannah, Georgia for 38 years, a pale yellow colonial with white shutters, a magnolia tree in the front yard, and a porch swing that had outlasted 3 sets of cushions. I had planted rose bushes along the fence. I had painted the kitchen myself twice. That house was not just walls and a roof. It was every morning coffee, every Thanksgiving dinner, every grandchild's first step on that hardwood floor. My husband was Gerald Ellison. We had married in 1989 when I was 51 and he was 55. Our children were already grown. We had been a second chance for both of us, or so I believed. Gerald was steady and quiet. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays. He watched the evening news. He called me Dot in a way that made the name sound permanent, like something carved in wood. My younger sister Vera had been in and out of our lives for years. Vera was 68, 6 years younger than me, and she had always carried herself like someone who deserved more than she had been given. She had been divorced twice. She visited us for holidays, sometimes for weeks at a time. I cooked for her. I lent her money I never asked back. She sat in my kitchen in my bathrobe and drank my coffee, and I was glad to have her there. That was the first mistake, confusing presence with loyalty. Looking back, I can trace the signs. Small, easy to dismiss, the kind of thing a trusting woman files under nothing. The way Gerald refilled Vera's wine glass before she asked. The way their laughter in the other room went quiet when I walked in. A glance held a second too long at the dinner table. I noticed. I told myself I was imagining things. 74 years of living should give a woman more credit than that. Last spring, Gerald had driven Vera to her doctor's appointment in Charleston, 2 hours each way. He told me her car was in the shop, a reasonable explanation. I ironed his shirt before he left. Then there was the phone. Gerald had never been secretive about his phone. He left it on the kitchen counter, on the nightstand, on the arm of the sofa. Suddenly it was always in his pocket, always face down. Once I walked into the bedroom and he closed an application and said, "Just checking the weather." It was 68 degrees and sunny. Neither of us mentioned it again. I should have asked. I didn't. Pride is a strange thing in old age. It keeps you from asking questions you already know the answers to. The afternoon it happened was a Tuesday in March. Gerald asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. The magnolia was starting to bloom outside the window. He stood by the counter with his arms crossed, and his face had the careful blankness of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "I want a divorce, Dot." I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming. I remember the roses I had cut that morning in a jar on the table. I asked him why. I kept my voice even. I had spent a lifetime keeping my voice even. He looked at me, not with guilt, not with sorrow, and he said it plainly, as if it were simply a fact of nature, like the direction of the wind. "I've always loved Vera more than you." The room did not spin. My heart did not race. I felt instead a terrible stillness, as if the world had stopped making a sound I had not even known I was hearing until it was gone. 38 years. A yellow house. Rose bushes along a fence. He said he was sorry. He didn't sound sorry. He said Vera would be moving in, that he expected me to be out within 60 days, per the legal timeline his attorney had already outlined. His attorney. He had already spoken to an attorney. I stood up from the table, smoothed my dress, and walked out to the porch. I sat in the swing. The magnolia smelled the way it always had. I looked at the rose bushes I had planted with my own hands, and I thought, he has been planning this. For how long? I did not cry. Not then. I was 74 years old and I had 60 days to figure out what was left of my life. I sat on that porch swing until the sun dropped behind the neighbor's oak trees and the air turned cool. I could hear Gerald moving around inside, opening drawers, the sound of the television. Normal sounds. Domestic sounds. The sounds of a man who had just blown up a marriage and gone back to his evening routine. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Gerald had not acted impulsively. Impulsive men do not have attorneys on retainer before they say the words. He had planned this, quietly, over months, maybe longer, while I refilled his coffee and tended my roses and believed that my life was what it appeared to be. I went inside, walked past him without a word, and went to the bedroom. I sat at my writing desk, the small oak one I had bought at an estate sale in 1994, and I took out a legal pad. Old habit. When I was frightened, I made lists. What I have. The house had been purchased in 1986 before our marriage. Gerald had moved in when we wed. His name had been added to the deed in 1991, at his request, as a gesture of commitment. I had agreed without a lawyer, without a second thought. I remembered signing the paper on this same desk. What I don't have. Savings. We had maintained a joint account for the entirety of our marriage. Gerald managed the finances. I had trusted that arrangement entirely. I did not know in that moment exactly how much was in that account. I did not know if anything had been moved. What I need to find out? Everything. The next morning, I drove to the bank before Gerald was awake. I wore my good coat, the navy one I kept for church. I sat down with a branch manager, a young woman named Carla, who looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone trained not to react. The joint checking account had $4,200. The joint savings account, which had held, as of our last statement I could recall, approximately $78,000, had $6,100. When were the transfers made? I asked. Carla printed the records. Over 14 months, a series of transfers had moved money to an account I did not recognize. Steady, unremarkable amounts. $3,000 here, $5,000 there. The kind of pattern designed not to trigger a flag. I folded the papers and put them in my purse. How long had he been planning this? Since Vera's last long visit, 18 months ago? I drove home, made myself breakfast, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter. Gerald was still asleep. I looked at the kitchen I had painted. Cream walls, blue tile backsplash, a small watercolor of the Georgia coast that my daughter Margaret had given me years ago. I had made this home out of nothing but time and care. I was not going to leave it without a fight. That afternoon, while Gerald was at his weekly golf game, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my daughter Margaret, who lived in Atlanta. I told her, briefly and without dramatics, what had happened. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "Mom, don't touch anything else in that house. Don't move a single thing. I'm calling you back in an hour." The second call was to Eleanor Marsh, my closest friend of 40 years, a retired schoolteacher who had been through her own brutal divorce in her 60s. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. "Eleanor," I said, "I need the name of your attorney." She gave it to me without asking a single question. That is the mark of a true friend. The attorney's name was Patricia Holt. She had an office on Bull Street, downtown Savannah. Margaret had already done her own research by the time she called me back. Patricia Holt was known for high-conflict divorce cases and had a reputation for methodical, relentless preparation. I made an appointment for Thursday morning. For 2 days, I said nothing to Gerald. I cooked dinner. I answered his questions in full sentences. I watched him watching me, looking for signs of collapse or capitulation, and I gave him neither. Did he expect me to beg? To fall apart? To simply pack a bag and go? He did not know me as well as he thought. On Wednesday evening, Vera called the house phone. Gerald answered and carried the phone to the other room. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing a single cup, and I listened to the low murmur of his voice. Comfortable, warm, the voice he used to use with me. My plan was simple, and it was real. I would engage a divorce attorney, document the financial transfers, establish my legal claim to the house, and protect whatever remained of what was mine. I had no illusions that this would be easy or painless or fast. But I had built this life from the ground up, and I was not a woman who walked away from what she had made. I dried the cup, put it in the cabinet, and went to bed. Thursday morning, I drove to Bull Street, parked the car, and walked into Patricia Holt's office wearing the same navy coat. The plan had begun. Patricia Holt's office smelled of coffee and old books, and she did not waste my time with pleasantries. She was in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a yellow legal pad already open on her desk. She asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I did. She took notes in a small, precise hand. When I finished, she set down her pen. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "you've brought me bank records, a marriage certificate, and the original deed to your property. That's more than most clients come in with." "I taught school for 22 years, I said. "I know what documentation looks like." She allowed herself a brief smile. Then she became serious. The legal picture, she explained, was complicated but not hopeless. Because Gerald's name had been added to the deed after our marriage, and because Georgia was an equitable distribution state, the house was considered marital property. However, my prior ownership, the length of my residency, my documented contributions to the property's upkeep and value, all of these were factors a court would consider. The more pressing issue was the money. "These transfers," she said, spreading the bank records on her desk, "are consistent with a pattern of dissipation of marital assets. If we can show they were intentional, made in anticipation of divorce, to benefit a third party. You have grounds for a claim that goes well beyond normal division. A third party. Vera, my sister. How do we prove intention?" I asked. "We subpoena records," she said. "His bank account, phone records if necessary, correspondence. And we move quickly before anything else disappears." I authorized everything she needed. I wrote the retainer check and did not flinch at the amount. I had savings of my own, a small account in my name alone, opened years ago without particular foresight that Gerald had apparently overlooked. It would cover the retainer and more. Walking out of Patricia's office and into the March sunlight on Bull Street, I felt something I had not felt in days. Clarity. Not happiness, not relief. Just the clean, steadying sensation of having taken a real step in a real direction. But what would happen when Gerald realized I was not simply grieving and waiting? I did not have to wait long to find out. That Friday evening, Gerald came home from dinner. He had not asked me to join him, and I had not offered, and found me at the writing desk in the bedroom, reviewing a copy of our mortgage documents. He stood in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading," I said, and did not look up. The next morning, he was on the phone before I came downstairs. By afternoon, his manner had shifted. He was watchful. He moved around the house quietly, opening and closing the office door, spending time at his own desk. That evening, he came to me in the kitchen. "I think we should try to handle this amicably," he said. "No need to involve a lot of lawyers." "I've already involved a lawyer," I said, and turned back to the stove. He was silent for a moment. Then, "Patricia Holt?" I looked at him then. His jaw was tight. He had already heard the name, which meant Vera had contacts, or he did, and they were already talking. About me. The following week brought the evidence I had been waiting for. Patricia's office had moved quickly. Working through legal channels, she had obtained records for the account to which Gerald's transfers had been directed. It was a personal account, opened 14 months ago. The account holder was Vera Louise Granger, my sister's full legal name. Patricia laid the printout in front of me on her desk. He was transferring money directly to her, I said. Not a question. 14 months of deposits, Patricia confirmed. Total, $71,850. I sat with that number for a moment. $71,850. Money from our joint savings. Money that had included my half. Money I had contributed to through years of working, of managing the household, of making the kind of domestic investments that don't show up on a balance sheet, but hold a family together. He had been funding her. All the while visiting my kitchen, sitting at my table, kissing my cheek at Christmas. How does a woman look her sister in the eyes across a holiday table while taking her money? I did not have an answer for that. I was not sure there was one. We file next week, Patricia said. Once we file, the clock starts. He'll know immediately. File, I said. There was no going back now. There had probably been no going back since the moment Gerald stood in my kitchen by the roses and told me the truth he had been hiding for over a year. But this paper, this number, this proof, this was the lock turning in the door. I drove home through Savannah in the late afternoon light, past the squares with their live oaks draped in Spanish moss, past the old churches, past the houses that had stood for 200 years. My house had stood for 38 of my years. I intended to keep it. The divorce filing landed on a Wednesday. Patricia had prepared me. By Thursday morning, he'll know. His attorney will call him before he's had his coffee. She was right. I was in the kitchen at 7:15 when Gerald came downstairs holding his phone. He set it face down on the table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him in 38 years. Something between fury and calculation. You filed for contested divorce, he said. I did, I said, and poured my coffee. You're claiming dissipation of marital assets. I am. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Dorothy, this is going to get ugly. It already is ugly, Gerald, I said. You made it ugly. I'm just responding accordingly. He left the house an hour later. I heard him on the phone in the driveway before he drove away. That afternoon, Vera called my cell phone, a number she had not used in weeks. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was brief and tightly controlled. Dot, I think we should talk. All three of us, like adults. I saved the recording and forwarded it to Patricia. The real escalation came 4 days later. I was in the garden. It was a warm afternoon, the roses were coming in, when Gerald's car pulled into the driveway, followed by a second car I didn't recognize. Gerald got out, and then Vera got out of the second car. She was dressed carefully, hair done, wearing a blazer as though this were a business meeting. They had come together, coordinated, rehearsed. I set down my pruning shears and waited. Gerald spoke first. His tone was controlled, but his eyes were hard. He said my filing had made specific allegations that could damage his professional reputation. He still consulted for a commercial real estate firm. He said if I continued, he would counterclaim that I had been mentally diminished in recent years and was unfit to manage significant assets. He used the phrase cognitive decline. He said it without flinching. I looked at him for a long moment. Gerald, I just organized 14 months of bank records, identified a fraudulent transfer pattern, retained one of the best divorce attorneys in Savannah, and filed a legally precise contested claim. If that's cognitive decline, I'd hate to see what competence looks like. Vera stepped forward then. Her voice was softer, designed to sound reasonable. Dot, nobody wants this to go to court. Think about the family. Think about what this does to Margaret, to the grandchildren. Don't, I said. Don't use my daughter's name right now. We're offering a settlement, Gerald said. Fair market split on the house, 60-40. You get the 60. We walk away from the asset claims. 60% of a house I had owned alone for 3 years before he ever walked through the door, and they called it fair. My attorney will be in touch, I said, and picked up my pruning shears. Gerald's voice dropped. Dorothy, I'm warning you. Don't make this worse than it needs to be. I turned and looked at him, really looked at him, and I said, calmly and clearly, I've been making this garden for 30 years. I planted every one of these roses. I am not leaving this property, and I am not accepting 60% of what is mine. You're going to want to get back in your car now. There was a silence. Vera glanced at Gerald. Something passed between them. A recalculation. They left. I stood in the garden for a long time after the cars disappeared. My hands were steady. My pulse, to my own mild surprise, was even. But I was tired in a way that went down to the bone. Not the fatigue of weakness, but the exhaustion of someone who had been braced for impact and had taken the blow and was still standing. I called Margaret that evening and told her what had happened. She was angry in the direct, efficient way that she had always been angry. She had gotten that from me, I like to think. She wanted to drive down immediately. I told her not yet. Give me a few days, I said. I need some quiet. I spent the next 3 days in a kind of deliberate stillness. I read. I worked in the garden in the mornings. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat and ate them slowly. Eleanor came over on Saturday, and we sat on the porch with iced tea and didn't talk about Gerald or Vera for an entire hour. We talked about her granddaughter's school play, about a book we had both read, about the way the wisteria was coming in along the back fence. When had I last simply sat on my own porch without dread? I let myself rest. But underneath the quiet, Patricia's process was moving forward. Subpoenas served, records requested, a court date set for preliminary hearings in 6 weeks. I had planted these roses. I had painted these walls. I had earned every square foot of this life. 3 days of rest, then back to work. On the 4th morning, the quiet broke, not with a confrontation but with an envelope. It was hand-delivered, slipped through the mail slot before I was awake, with no return address. Inside was a single page, a revised settlement offer typed on Gerald's attorney's letterhead. The terms had shifted. Now they were offering 65% of the house's appraised value, a lump sum of $15,000 for household transition costs, and a clause, buried in the 3rd paragraph, that required me to sign a full release of all asset dissipation claims. In other words, take the money, drop the fraud case, and go quietly. I read it twice over my morning coffee. Then I set it on the desk and called Patricia. They're nervous, she said, before I had finished describing the document. I know, I said. The release clause is the tell. They want you to walk away from the $71,000 claim. That number is the one that damages them, not just in divorce court, but potentially beyond it, if the transfers are found to constitute fraud against a marital estate. I'm not signing it, I said. I didn't think you would be. I'll draft a formal rejection this afternoon. I went about my day. I weeded the front bed, paid 2 bills, made a grocery list. The offer sat on the desk like something inert, a spent cartridge, already fired and missed. Did they believe that a better number would simply change my mind? That I was negotiating over money rather than fighting for what was mine? They had misunderstood me from the beginning. Gerald had looked at a 74-year-old woman and seen someone to be managed, eased out, compensated minimally, filed away. He had not considered that I might be someone who kept records, who had a mind like a trap, who had spent 50 years navigating institutions and bureaucracies and difficult people. He had seen my age. He had not seen me. That afternoon, my friend Eleanor brought over a casserole and stayed for 3 hours. Eleanor had divorced at 63 after discovering her husband had been maintaining a second household, a fact I had helped her navigate at the time, sitting in her kitchen, making the same kind of tea she was now making in mine. She understood something about this that most people didn't. that the damage wasn't primarily financial or legal, though those things mattered. The damage was to the architecture of your life, the daily story you had been telling yourself about who you were and where you belonged. "You know what saved me?" she said. "People, not advice, not even money. People who came and sat in the room." She was right, and I had been letting myself be too isolated. Over the following days, I began deliberately rebuilding my circle. Margaret drove down from Atlanta on Friday and stayed the weekend. She was 48 now, a real estate attorney herself, a fact I had not fully appreciated until she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, carefully, "Mom, I've been looking at the deed history, and I want to talk to Patricia about something." She had noticed a legal argument around my original sole ownership that Patricia had touched on, but not yet fully developed. I watched my daughter work and felt something I hadn't expected: pride. My son Daniel called from Portland. He was less combative than Margaret, but steadier. He asked good questions, didn't catastrophize, and ended the call with, "You know you can come here any time, but I also know you're not going anywhere." He knew me. On Sunday afternoon, 3 women from my church came by: Ruth, Connie, and Helen. We were part of the same circle of women who had known each other for 25 years. They brought food. They didn't ask intrusive questions. Ruth simply sat next to me on the porch and said, "We're here, Dot. Whatever you need." Connie, who had survived her own illness and recovery 2 years before, said something I wrote down later. "The ones who try to knock you down are always counting on you to be alone." Was that what Gerald had counted on? That I was old and tired and alone enough to simply comply? Perhaps, but I was not alone. That Sunday evening, after everyone had gone, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something settle in me. Not complacency, but groundedness. A widened base. The case was moving. Patricia was working. My daughter had come. My friends had come. Gerald and Vera were watching and waiting, trying to read what I would do next. Let them watch. They came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing. I saw Gerald's car from the front window, and I took a slow breath before I opened the door. Vera was with him. She was dressed softly this time, no blazer, no business armor. She wore a pale blue cardigan I recognized from years ago, one I had actually given her for a birthday. Whether that was deliberate or accidental, I couldn't say. I had known Vera my entire life. I had dressed her as a child, braided her hair, lent her my coat at our mother's funeral. Standing at my own front door, looking at the cardigan I had wrapped and given her with love, I felt the particular grief of betrayal that has no clean name. Not anger, not sorrow, but something that sits between them and doesn't move. Gerald asked if they could come in. I stood in the doorway. "You can sit on the porch," I said. We sat. They on the wicker chairs, me on the swing. The same swing where I had sat the evening this all began. The magnolia was in full bloom now. The roses along the fence were opening. I had watered them that morning, same as any other morning. Whatever happened on this porch, the roses still needed water. There was something grounding in that. Gerald spoke first. He said he had been thinking. He said he knew that things had gotten out of hand. He used the word sorry twice, but each time it was attached to a condition. Sorry that I had felt hurt. Sorry that things had become complicated. Not sorry for what he had done. Sorry for its consequences. I had taught school long enough to know the difference between an apology and a legal disclaimer delivered in a softer voice. Then Vera leaned forward with her hands clasped in her lap, and her voice was warm and intimate, the voice I had known all my life, the voice I had trusted for 68 years. "Dot," she said, "we're family. Whatever has happened between us, that doesn't change. Gerald and I love you. We don't want to be your enemies. This court case is going to hurt everyone. The grandchildren will hear about it. Margaret is already involved. It's going to drag through the public record. Is that really what you want? There it was. Not a reconciliation. A pressure point, wrapped in the language of love. You're asking me to drop the asset dissipation claim, I said. A small pause. Gerald said, We're asking you to consider what a prolonged court case costs everyone. It costs you approximately $71,850 in documented fraud, I said pleasantly. I can see why you'd prefer to avoid that. Vera's warm expression flickered. Dot, you're making this into something adversarial. Vera, I looked at my sister. You accepted $71,000 in transfers from my joint marital account over 14 months, while visiting my home, while sitting at my table. I kept my voice even. This is adversarial because the actions that created it were adversarial. I didn't make it that way. I thought of all the mornings she had sat in that kitchen, all the meals I had cooked, the birthday card she had sent me last year with the words, "My dearest sister," written inside. I had kept it in the drawer. I did not mention it. There was nothing to say about it that the bank records hadn't already said more plainly. Gerald stood up. His voice was controlled, but the control was effortful now. Dorothy, I'm going to say this plainly. If you continue with the fraud claim, we will file a counterclaim regarding your mental competency. We've spoken to a physician who has agreed to provide a preliminary assessment. This will become a very public, very humiliating process for you. A physician. He had found someone. I felt it then. A cold current of genuine fear. Not of losing, but of exposure. Of being turned into a story. A confused old woman. A sad case. A grandmother who had become a problem to be managed. The humiliation of it. The way people would look at me. The way my grandchildren might one day read a court record and find their grandmother described as diminished, unreliable, a woman whose own judgment could not be trusted. That fear was real, and I did not pretend otherwise. Even to myself, the fear lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then something replaced it. A hard, clear heat, like a coal touched with air. If Gerald was willing to do that, to weaponize my age, to pay a physician to question my mind in open court, then I had been right about him all along. Not just unfaithful, not just opportunistic. Something colder than that. A man who would dismantle a woman's dignity to protect his bank account was not a man who had ever truly seen her. Thank you for being honest, I said. I stood up from the swing. I'll make sure Patricia is aware of the potential counterclaim first thing tomorrow. That kind of threat, made in front of a witness, has its own legal implications. Now, I'd like you both to leave my property. Gerald stared at me for a moment. Vera had gone very still. She looked for just a second, like someone who had only just understood what she had gotten herself into. This is going to go badly for you, he said. Get off my porch, Gerald. They left. I stood at the porch rail and watched the tail lights disappear down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses down. The magnolias stirred in a small evening wind. My hands were cold. I went inside, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table. The fear was still there, small and hard, like a stone in the chest. But I had learned something about fear in 74 years. It was not the opposite of courage. It was the material courage was made from. You felt the cold of it, and you kept moving. I called Patricia that evening and told her everything that had been said. Every word in order. The competency threat, she said, is aggressive and legally risky for them. It draws attention to their behavior, not just yours. If they file, we answer it. Hard. A pause. But Dot, this also tells us something. They're frightened, I said. Yes, she said. They're running out of moves. I hung up the phone and sat for a while longer in the kitchen. The tea went cold. I didn't mind. I was thinking about the way Vera's face had looked in that last moment on the porch. Not triumphant, not even angry. Just caught. The face of a woman who had made a very long bet on the wrong outcome. 3 weeks to the hearing, I was ready. The preliminary hearing was held on a Thursday morning in late April at the Chatham County Courthouse, in a wood-paneled room with tall windows that let in the kind of pale spring light that makes everything look both ordinary and significant. Patricia and I arrived early. I wore a gray suit, the one I had bought for a professional function years ago, still well-fitted, still authoritative. I carried a leather portfolio. I was calm in a way I had not predicted being calm. Not the stillness of fear, but something quieter and more durable. I had spent the previous evening at the kitchen table reviewing the full file one last time, not because I needed to, but because the act of reviewing it reminded me of how much ground I had covered, how much of the truth I had pulled into the light with my own hands. By the time I closed the folder and went to bed, I was not nervous. I was prepared. Those are different things. Gerald arrived with his attorney, a man named Bowers, tall, smooth, the kind of lawyer who wore confidence like a second suit. Vera was not present. She had not been subpoenaed for this proceeding, but her name was in every page of every document spread across our table. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Sandra Baines. She had a reputation, Patricia had told me, for impatience with theater and precision with numbers. I considered that a good sign. The proceeding began with standard preliminary matters: division of assets, contested claims, the house deed history. Bowers made his opening position smoothly: marital property under Georgia law, equitable division, Gerald's contribution to the household over 38 years of marriage. He spoke well. He said nothing that was technically false. He was very good at that. The architecture of a story that leaves out its most important rooms. Then Patricia put the bank records on the table. She walked through the 14 months of transfers with the methodical care of someone explaining a self-evident thing to a patient audience: dates, amounts, the destination account, the name on the destination account: Vera Louise Granger. Bowers objected twice. Judge Baines overruled both times and told him to let the record be established. "Mr. Ellison," Patricia said, turning to Gerald with the records displayed, "were you aware that this account belonged to Vera Granger at the time of the transfers?" Gerald looked at Bowers. Bowers gave the smallest nod. "I was providing financial assistance to a family member," Gerald said. "A family member," Patricia repeated, "specifically your wife's sister." "That's correct. From the joint marital account, an account to which Mrs. Ellison contributed financially throughout your marriage. We both contributed to the household. Did Mrs. Ellison authorize these transfers?" A pause. Bowers started to speak. Judge Baines raised one finger. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "answer the question." "She was aware of my support for her family," he said. It was not an answer. It was the language of a man who had prepared a deflection and was hoping no one would notice the difference. I had seen that particular construction before. The pivot to an adjacent truth when the real answer is unavailable. I had taught 7th grade English for 11 years. I knew evasion in every form it took. "I'd like to submit," Patricia said, "a signed statement from Mrs. Ellison, affirming that she had no knowledge of or authorization for any of the 14 transfers documented here, and that she first learned of these transfers upon requesting records from her bank branch on March 11th of this year." The statement was admitted. Then Patricia set a second document on the table. I had not seen this one before. She had held it for this moment. I realized, watching her place it with the particular care of someone setting down something fragile and decisive, that she had planned the sequence of this presentation, the way a conductor plans the final movement. I'd also like to submit text message records obtained through legal subpoena between Mr. Ellison and Mrs. Granger, spanning the period of November of last year through February of this year. Gerald's composure broke, not dramatically, not visibly to someone who didn't know how to look, but I had looked at that face for 38 years. His jaw tightened. His right hand on the table went still in the way that a person goes still when they are doing the rapid private arithmetic of consequences. Patricia read 3 of the messages aloud, each admitted into the record. They were not romantic in nature. They were operational. They discussed the transfers. One message, from Gerald to Vera, read, "Moved another $4K. Don't use it until after the filing. We talked about this." Another, from Vera to Gerald. "What happens if she finds the account before you file? What happens if she finds the account before you file?" 38 years of marriage, and my sister had been asking him what happened if I noticed. Sitting there in that wood-paneled room in the spring light, I thought about all the ordinary mornings that had existed inside those 14 months. Mornings when I had made coffee and tended the garden and called Vera on her birthday. And all the while this other conversation had been running underneath, steady and deliberate, like water moving below ice. The room was very quiet. Judge Baines looked at Gerald over her reading glasses for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable for anyone. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The silence itself was a verdict of atmosphere, if not yet of law. Bowers requested a brief recess. It was granted. In the corridor, I could hear, not the words, but the compressed urgency of 2 men trying to reassemble a strategy that had just come apart at its seams. I sat at the table and did not move. Patricia made a note on her legal pad. Outside the tall windows, a pigeon landed on the ledge and then flew away. When we returned, Bowers made a revised statement. Gerald wished to explore the possibility of a negotiated settlement. He recognized that certain aspects of the financial record warranted discussion. Patricia looked at me. I gave her the nod we had agreed on. "Mrs. Ellison," Patricia said, "is prepared to receive a full settlement proposal that addresses the complete marital estate, including the fraudulent dissipation of $71,850 in joint marital funds, the full appraisal value of the marital home, and appropriate compensation for the harm caused. She is not interested in partial measures." Judge Baines set a follow-up date for 3 weeks out and made clear, in language that left nothing ambiguous, that the documentary record was sufficient to support the fraud claim proceeding to full hearing if no resolution was reached. Gerald did not look at me as he left the room. I sat for a moment after they had gone. Patricia gathering her files, the clerk resetting the room. The spring light through the tall windows was steady and white. I thought about the writing desk in my bedroom, the legal pad I had taken out the night Gerald told me he was leaving, the list I had made, what I have, what I don't have, what I need to find out. I had found out. I had documented it. I had walked it into a courtroom and laid it on a table in the light. He had moved money to my sister for 14 months. She had asked him what happened if I found it. And they had both thought I wouldn't. I put on my coat, picked up my portfolio, and walked out of the courthouse into the April air. The 3 weeks between the hearing and the follow-up date were the quietest of the entire ordeal. Gerald did not call. Vera did not call. The silence after months of pressure had its own texture. Not peaceful exactly, but clarifying. The way a room feels after a long argument has finally ended, and the air settles. I went about my days with the steadiness of someone who has done everything that can be done and is now waiting for the machinery of justice to complete its turn. Bowers sent 3 written communications to Patricia, each one an incremental adjustment from the last, each one attempting to reintroduce the full release of the fraud claim in some form or another. The first framed it as a mutual release of claims. The second called it a comprehensive resolution agreement. The third dressed it in language so convoluted it took Patricia a full paragraph to explain what it was actually asking. The answer to all 3 was the same. "They're trying to find the version of this you'll accept," she told me. "There isn't one," I said. On the eve of the follow-up court date, Bowers made one final submission: a comprehensive settlement proposal. Patricia called me to walk through it, and she went through every line carefully, noting what had changed. Her voice had a quality I had come to recognize over the months, not excitement, but a kind of focused satisfaction, the tone of someone who has argued a position thoroughly and is watching the other side acknowledge the ground they've lost. The house. Gerald was relinquishing all claim to the property. His name would be removed from the deed in full. The magnolia tree, the rose beds, the porch swing, the blue tile backsplash, all of it, legally and permanently, mine, the joint account. He was restoring the depleted savings in full. $71,850, the exact amount of the documented transfers to Vera's account. Every dollar that had been moved in the dark returned to the light. Additionally, in recognition of the fraudulent dissipation of marital assets and the documented harm to the marital estate, a further payment of $120,000 would be made to me, structured as a legal settlement rather than alimony to avoid certain tax complexities Patricia had already anticipated. She had anticipated them 3 months ago. That is what a good attorney does. There was no release clause. The admission of the transfer records into the court file stood as part of the public record. No signature of mine would seal them away, soften their language, or spare Gerald and Vera the consequence of their existence. There was one final item, a clause acknowledging in legal language that Mr. Gerald Ellison had made unauthorized transfers from a joint marital account to a third party, without Mrs. Dorothy Ellison's knowledge or consent. In writing, signed, permanent. "Dorothy," Patricia said, "this is everything we asked for." "I know," I said. "You want to accept?" "Yes," I said. "On one condition. I sign nothing until the deed transfer is processed and recorded. The house is in my name before any other document is signed." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual sequence. It's the sequence I need," I said. I had spent enough of this process trusting that things would resolve as promised. I was not going to sign away my legal leverage until the one thing I could not replace was secured in writing, filed, and beyond reach. Patricia understood that. She was the kind of lawyer who respected a client who knew exactly where the line was. She made it happen. 10 days later, I sat in the offices of the title company on Whitaker Street and watched as the revised deed was recorded, certified, and filed. The notary handed me the copy. I held it for a moment. A single sheet of paper that represented 38 years of roses and painted walls and morning coffee on a porch swing. Dorothy Ann Ellison. Sole owner. Then I signed the settlement agreement. I drove home through Savannah in the late morning. Past the squares. Past the live oaks with their Spanish moss moving in a light wind. Past the old churches that had stood through things far larger than one woman's divorce. The city looked the way it always looked, ancient and unhurried and indifferent to private catastrophe, which was exactly what I needed it to be. The check for the restored savings and the additional settlement arrived by certified mail 3 weeks later. I deposited it at the branch, where Carla, the young manager, had printed the original transfer records for me back in March. She recognized me when I walked in. I did not explain. I thanked her for her help in March and went home. She had done a small thing on an ordinary morning and had not known how much it mattered. Sometimes it works that way. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in June. The paperwork arrived in an envelope from Patricia's office. I opened it at the kitchen table, read through it completely, every clause, every signature line, every date, and then set it in the filing drawer where I kept important documents. Next to the deed. Next to the bank records I had brought to that first meeting on Bull Street, I called Margaret. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "All of it?" "All of it," I said. "The house is mine. The money is mine. The fraud claim is in the public record. It's done." She cried. I did not, at that moment. I had cried in private, at various points over the past months, and I had cried adequately. There is a kind of grief that requires solitude to be properly felt, and I had given it that. But I felt the full weight of it as she cried. The relief, the exhaustion, the strange ache of winning something you should never have had to fight for in the first place. That evening, I sat on the porch in the swing as the sun went down over the neighbors' oak trees. Gerald had moved out the month before. The house was entirely mine again. My shoes at the door, my books on the shelves, my rhythm in every room. I had rearranged the living room furniture the first weekend he was gone, not dramatically, just enough to make the space feel as though it had always been arranged this way. Perhaps it had always wanted to be. The roses were in full bloom along the fence. I had planted every one of them. I had tended them through drought years and rainy years, and through the strangest year of my life. They did not know any of that. They bloomed regardless, the way good things do when they are properly cared for. I had planted them, I had tended them, I had defended them, and I was still here. The summer after the divorce was, unexpectedly, one of the most alive I could remember. I had money, the house, and time. And for the first time in years, the clarity that comes when you stop accommodating other people's comfort at the expense of your own. I had lived carefully and quietly for a long time. I had earned a different kind of life. In July, I had the kitchen repainted. A warm sage green I would have chosen 20 years ago if I had been the one choosing. I replaced the living room sofa. I had the rose beds extended along the full length of the fence. Margaret came down for a long weekend in August. We sat on the porch the way we had when she was young and talked about everything and nothing for 3 days. She told me she had been afraid, during the worst months, that I might break. I told her I'd been afraid of the same thing. We agreed the fear had been incorrect. Then, that September, I received a phone call. The attorney's name was James Whitfield, calling from Nashville on behalf of the estate of Mr. Harold Cosgrove, who had passed away 7 weeks prior. Harold had named me as beneficiary in his will, Harold Cosgrove. I had been married to him for 4 years in the early 1970s. Young, badly matched, parted without malice. I had not spoken to him in decades. I knew he had gone into commercial real estate in Tennessee. I had not known how well he had done. The bequest was $89 million. I asked Mr. Whitfield to repeat the number. He did. Harold had never remarried. He had no children. Mr. Whitfield mentioned that Harold had kept a photograph of the two of us. Estate Park, 1971, young and laughing, in his office desk until the day he died. Sometimes people carry things quietly for a very long time. Margaret drove down the next day. We sat at the kitchen table in the new green kitchen and looked at each other. "Mom," she said. "I know," I said. "We hired a financial manager and an estate attorney that autumn. I established a trust for my grandchildren's education, donated to the Savannah Literacy Program I had volunteered with for 12 years, and contributed to a legal fund that helped women in contested divorces access representation. Patricia Holt received a letter from that fund 6 months later and called me laughing. I took the trip to the Scottish Highlands I had talked about for 30 years. Eleanor came with me. 14 days of walking and reading and not thinking about Savannah at all. And Gerald? And Vera? Gerald moved into a rented condominium on the south side of the city. He retired within the year. The public court record had made certain professional relationships difficult. He was not destitute. He was diminished in the ways that had always mattered most to him. Vera moved in with him. The relationship she had spent over a year constructing on transferred money and broken trust did not hold. Gerald, without financial ease, was not the man she had imagined. Within 8 months, she was gone. A small apartment, a city where she had no established life, 68 years old, and the bridge to the only family who had ever consistently loved her burned down to the water. She called me once, 7 months after the settlement. I let it go to voicemail. She said she was sorry. She sounded genuinely afraid. I did not call back. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. Some damage cannot be undone. I wished her no harm. I simply had nothing left to give, and I had finally learned not to offer what I didn't have. I planted 2 new rose varieties that autumn. One of them, I was told, could live for 50 years with proper care. I intended to be here for most of it. I am 75 years old and this is what I know. Love without honesty is performance. Trust without documentation is a risk you're not being asked to share.